Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's great to have you here. Another IANA webinar. Today, we're pleased to introduce a new series, Intermodal Analyzed, with Larry Gross. Larry's been kind enough to put together a great program for us, and we're going to have several of these throughout the year. So we hope that you find them enlightening, enjoyable, and thought-provoking. To start off, I'd like to thank our year-long gold sponsors. They're sponsoring this webinar, helping bring this, along with other intermodal programming, to you throughout the year. I'm Hal Pollard. I'm the Director of Education at IANA. It's great to have you all with us. Larry Gross needs no introduction. He's a good friend of IANA and of the industry. He's the principal and founder of Gross Transportation Consulting. And without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to Larry to talk us through some intermodal and analyze the situation. Larry?
Well, thank you, Hal, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody, as appropriate. It's great to be with you today from Durango, Colorado. And I want to extend my appreciation to Hal and the entire IANA Intermodal team for allowing me to participate in this new series, Intermodal Analyzed. I'm very excited about it. And I think it's a good way for IANA to help all of us keep up with these very fast changing events that we're all having the privilege of experiencing right now. This is the first of a series of such webinars that are going to be occurring on a monthly basis between myself and the TTX folks. We'll be doing our best to keep you up to speed on the latest of the intermodal trends. So here's my contact information. I tweet under the handle Intermodalist. You can also reach me at my email, and I'd be happy to chat with any of you if there are questions or concerns after the webinar. So let's jump into it. And what I'm going to do is talk just a little bit, perhaps less than normal, about what has happened, the data that we have. Because things are changing so rapidly, though, try and spend a little bit more time on at least talking about what we need to be thinking about as we look forward. But here's the most recent IANA data that came out covering May. And as always with IANA, ETSO data, the data concerns revenue movements of intermodal equipment. And we try and divide the market up by equipment type. And what you see in blue here are the monthly revenue moves that occurred in ISO containers, 20s, 40s, and 45 footers. The green is domestic equipment, which is 53-foot domestic containers, as well as trailers. And the red is the overall. The red reads off the left-hand axis. The green and blue read off the right-hand axis. And what you can see on the blue line, the international line, is that things appear to have bottomed out in terms of IPI, Inland Point Intermodal or International, in March. We saw a very good recovery in April, not all the way, obviously, back to where it was, but a bit of a surge as the volume started to flow back in from China as their economy reawakened after their lockdown, and a little bit of an easing off in May. On the domestic side, it looks like, looking at that green line, it bottomed out in April and has come back partially in May. The numbers exactly are on the next slide. So here are the year-over-year differences. And on the table to the right, you can see the May numbers, with the center column being what is the change from April, the month-to-month change. And then the right-hand column is the year-over-year change. If you look at the graph on the left, you can see that the international year-over-year deficit peaked in March, got quite a bit smaller in April. We're looking at those blue vertical bars, and has settled in May at about 17.7% deficit. The domestic deficit has been expanding dramatically from March to April, retreated a bit in May, back down to a total of about 13.2%. Now, if we look at the numbers here, and I'll highlight a couple of them. One of the things that's been very interesting is this huge increase in trailer volume from month to month that occurred between April and May. And what's going on there is a tremendous surge in premium intermodal traffic. This is parcels and LTL moving in support of the e-commerce boom, and we've all been making more use of e-commerce over the course of the pandemic, and trailers has really been a bit of a safety valve on that. On the domestic container front, domestic container increased a lesser amount, about 7.5% from April to May. Annual deficit, year-over-year deficit, about 13%. What I want to call your attention to, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this later in the presentation, is this huge differential in terms of the year over year between the private domestic container and the rail domestic container, with the rail domestic container deficit being a very significant over 21% deficit. So total is about 15.6% deficit. That is the largest year-over-year deficit that we've seen yet during the downturn. If we look at what's coming into our ports, so on the international side, and of course, almost 60% of all intermodal activity, if you count transloads, is being driven by international trade. We see that imports, also in line with the international intermodal volume, bottomed out in March. That's that blue line that you see here. Came up quite a bit in April, retreated slightly again when we got to May. A big decline from March to April in this yellow line here, which is exports. And so now we've really started to see, I think, the effects of the lockdown. How much of that is due to our economy being locked down and how much is due to collapse of demand overseas is yet to be determined. But if you look at the deficit, the year-over-year deficit for exports was about 16% in April, and that's about the same degree to which volume dropped from March. The import number, about 14.6%, lower than prior year, and down about 5.5% from the previous month. Now, if we look at this on a seasonally adjusted basis, which is this left-hand chart here, now we're looking at imports on a seasonally adjusted basis. Actually, in that respect, May is the lowest, weakest month yet. And that's because normally we would be expecting volume to be increasing from March to April to May as imports begin to spool up towards their typical seasonal peak, which occurs in August. So once we apply the seasonal adjustments to the May numbers, they look now certainly the weakest yet in terms of the pandemic lockdown. On a good news front, rail service, as we can measure it here, which is in terms of average intermodal train speeds that are reported to the Surface Transportation Board, we're looking very good. That's that red line that you see here. This is the current year, and we're running far above previous years, as well as the long-term average, which is this blue line, about 9.5% better than the 5-year average for all of the class ones. Now, how much of this is due to PSR and how much of it is due to the relative emptiness of the network and other trains not getting in the way of intermodal trains is a little bit difficult to say. The other shortcoming of this particular measure is it doesn't tell us anything about what happens once the train gets into the terminal. It only tells us how fast the train is between terminals. So this is at best an incomplete measure, but it's what I call a candle in a dark room. It helps us more than if we have nothing at all. Now, I mentioned how fast changing things are, and so therefore I'm much more interested versus the May numbers in looking at the more recent data. Here we are just 1 week prior to the end of second quarter, looking at the AAR numbers, which are weekly numbers that come out every Wednesday covering the prior week ending the prior Saturday. And the yellow line here shows you what those weekly volumes have been. The red bars are the year-over-year change. And what I want to point out is this recovery here has been actually quite robust. And it looks like volume bottomed out, AAR intermodal volume. This is all trailers, containers. We can't differentiate between international or domestic. This is all in. But things bottomed out in the middle of May and have been on a pretty good increase since then. This dip that you see right here is the Memorial Day week holiday. So that's sort of an artifact of the holiday week. You can ignore that and just look at the contracting year-over-year deficits. And frankly, I will tell you that I've been quite pleasantly surprised at just how rapidly things have been recovering. Most recently, the most recent week, we're at a deficit of about 21,000 units per week versus prior year. But the increase that's been over the course of this recovery so far has been about 4,400 loads a week. Now, some of that, again, might be seasonal improvement. So we can't just take this number and divide it into this number and say, oh, another 5 weeks will be even. At this point, we'll just set this aside for a minute and talk about what we need to be thinking about as we look forward here in terms of a forecast. And we talk about making an educated forecast, and because of the sort of unprecedented nature of this situation, actually one of the unprecedented things is just how many times we end up using the word unprecedented these days. But we do need more than the normal kind of education in order to make an educated forecast. What kinds of education do we need on our forecasting team? Well, the first thing we probably need is we need a PhD in epidemiology, which is the study of diseases. Because at the basis of any forecast is going to be these questions that you see here, which is all about the virus. And what is the virus going to do? Will reopening the economy spark new outbreaks? We're beginning to see that the answer perhaps on this one, unfortunately, may be yes. Are we still in the first wave? Probably so. Will there be a second wave? Maybe. And if so, when will that happen and how bad will it be? We need answers to all of these questions if we're going to make even a halfway intelligent forecast of what's going to happen with the economy. But that's not enough, because we also need on our team, we need somebody with at least a master's degree in political science, because these following questions here, among many others, need to be answered, which is how fast will we be reopened? How fast will our governors and the federal government be trying to push things to reopen? Very importantly, how long will the federal support of the economy be continued? A lot is riding on this question. We've got $600 going to each individual a week. That will be terminating in July 26th. Will that be renewed? In what form? For how long? All of these are very important questions, because this federal support, they've been pouring in, both the Federal Reserve and the federal government, pouring money into support the economy, which perhaps is one reason we saw this nice recovery in loads. But was that going to continue? And then a topic that would be at the front of everybody's mind in a normal situation is who's going to be controlling the federal government after Election Day. If control changes parties, things are going to look a whole lot different from a regulatory standpoint, from a lot of different standpoints as we get towards the end of the year. Now, the third degree that we need, the third expert that we need on our team is a sociologist, because we need to answer these questions even if the economy is reopened, even if your governor says, oh, it's okay to go to a restaurant. Are we all collectively going to be willing to do that? Are we going to be willing to go to a stadium and attend a crowded event, or jump on an airplane and resume our business travel lives or our vacations? These are all questions that we control, not the government. And so one of the core questions, both from a long-term and a short-term standpoint, is how will our behaviors be changed, and how long will it take for these changes to occur, and how long will the changes last? And after we have answers to all of these questions, only then can we get to the normal questions regarding forecasting, which is economics. And we probably need a PhD in this case, because we don't really have any precedent to a situation where the economy is put into a medically induced coma, which is in a sense what's happened here with the pandemic and the lockdown. And the longer that medically induced coma goes on, the more damage intuitively is being done, but we don't know how much long-term damage. We don't know what the effects of this lingering, unavoidable uncertainty will be. So that's our all-star forecasting team. Unfortunately, all you have talking to you today is an analyst with a MBA, obviously not particularly well qualified to make a detailed forecast. In truth, nobody is. The degree of uncertainty that's associated makes any forecast at this point, to put it mildly, hugely speculative. Somebody will end up being right at the end of all of this. That person will be hailed a genius. But in my estimation, whether it's myself or somebody else, it will actually be purely more a matter of luck. Now, we have all kinds of letters to characterize what the downturn and the recovery might look like. And what we're hoping for is the V-shaped recovery, which shows a rapid decline. We've already experienced that, and then an equally rapid recovery, which we're starting to experience seemingly. And it goes all the way back, and it's as in short order, it's as if nothing had happened. I put that term "nothing" in quotes. Then, of course, there's the U-shaped recovery, which shows a steep downturn and then a more leisurely, prolonged return to normal. And it might be the lazy U recovery, which takes a real long time to get back to normal. We might have the dreaded W recovery, which is what happens perhaps if we have a second wave of the pandemic or withdrawal of the government support. We don't really know how the economy is going to react. So perhaps we'll have a spurt that we're experiencing now, but then it recedes and we go back down part of the way, we go back down all the way, or in the case of a really bad second wave, perhaps even deeper on the second go around. We just don't know. Then there's the one that actually is my preferred option, which is the square root recovery. And that's one where we see a relatively rapid partial return, and we're obviously in the midst of that right now. But then it peters out somewhere short of where we were. And at that point, then where it goes from there is kind of speculative. This one shows a small retreat and then a slow recovery and improvement from there. It could be a bigger retreat, or it could be just a slowdown in the pace of recovery. And I don't think that the current pace of recovery is going to be sustained. That would look something like this theoretically. But frankly, I think with the amount of uncertainty out there, a number of unanswered questions, and the number of potential downsides, I would be very surprised if we see this level of recovery being maintained for too much longer. I don't know where the inflection will be or when or how bad, to be honest with you, but I think that in my personal opinion, this scenario is somewhat unlikely. And that something more like this is a bit of a more likely scenario. Just to put some numbers to it, my estimate for Q2, which is we're pretty much almost in the bag at this point, is about a 13.5% year-over-year deficit for overall intermodal activity. But frankly, I'm not looking for that deficit to contract very fast in Q3. We may see some improvement, but at the same time, even though we see sequential gains in intermodal volume, we are normally expecting to see that from a seasonal perspective. So in order to see a reduction in the year-over-year deficit, we've got to be gaining volume faster than we normally would. Frankly, I'm just a little bit skeptical on that. And so from my standpoint, rather than rely on any forecast, my advice for the audience is that you've got to, at this point, be very, very flexible, have your contingency plans in place for potential retrenchment, as well as, if I'm completely wrong, which certainly could be, a capacity shortage. We certainly are starting to see some signs of tightness on the spot market trucking side. We're seeing some signs of tightness in the intermodal domestic box supply, mainly, I think, because of the boxes being caught on the wrong place than so much a basic shortage of equipment that's just not in where it needs to be right now. So there's a lot, there's the array of potential outcomes here in the near term is extremely broad. And flexibility, I think, is going to be the watchword for all of us as we watch these events unfold. Now, at this point, I'm going to switch gears and show you a very interesting and powerful new tool that we have developed in conjunction with IANA called the Intermodal Volume Analyzer. And I'm extremely pleased and proud to be able to say that my little company, Gross Transportation Consulting, has teamed up with IANA on this. And in fact, we are offering discounts on both products, my new analytical report, Intermodal In Depth, and the Intermodal Volume Analyzer from IANA. You can save 20% when you subscribe to both. But I want to take a moment to both show you the volume analyzer and give you a demonstration of it, as well as perhaps tease out some more data in terms of what we're seeing right now in the recent IANA trends. And this is what the Intermodal Volume Analyzer looks like. It ties into the very powerful IANA ETSO database, and ETSO stands for Equipment Type, Size, and Ownership. And it is a region-to-region database that tracks all the flows, the intermodal flows moving between each of these different regions with all of the characteristics of those flows identified in the data. So for instance here, we have two main pages to the volume analyzer, the summary comparison page and the lane comparison page. And here you can see the summary comparison page. Every month it comes out with the new latest data and what is the year-over-year change from 2020 to 2019, also the quarter-to-date data. And we have across the top here these buttons which are called slicers. And they're called that because they enable us to slice and dice the data. We also have a lane comparison page, which allows us to look at the volume by equipment type moving between any or all of the intermodal lanes. So for instance, this is all the volume, but I can, for instance, pick, this is all the volume moving out of every IANA region, just flowing into the Northeast. And so very quickly, you're able to see the directional volumes. Here's the Midwest to Northeast volumes. There were 88,618 units moving out of the Midwest, revenue movements into the Northeast in the month of May. This is the same data. I've just made it a little bit easier to read for the webinar purposes. And let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. So here we can see in May, overall intermodal volume was down 15.6% year over year, 1.3 million intermodal revenue movements, just up a little bit from the prior month, which was 1.28 million revenue movements. If we look at the international volume, so this is now all containers, 20s, 40, 45 foot long, down 17.7%, as we previously mentioned, about 672,000 moves. On the domestic side, down 13.2% year over year in May, about 650,000 revenue moves. Now, if we look at the trailer side, here's the trailer numbers, 15.2%, but a big increase in terms of percentages from April to May, 71,000 to 87,000. Let's take a look at the domestic container. Now, if you notice, when I pick the container, now we just have available the lengths of 48, 53, and 60 feet. Those are the only domestic container sizes that are out there. And we have both the private and the rail segments. If we look at the privately owned domestic containers, there's that 9.7% year-over-year deficit. On the rail side, 21.1%. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail, this 21.1%. And so when we look at these individual lanes here, what we're looking for is a combination of good sized volume and a huge percentage drop. So for instance, we have here a little bit of a misleader. Oh, let's pick one here. Eastern Canada to Mexico, a 70% drop year over year, but only 160 moves, 160 revenue movements. So a big percentage drop, but not terribly meaningful. But there are two region pairs that I think are very significant. And if you look at these numbers, you can see them. One is the Midwest South Central, which has good sized volume and a very significant 64% year over year decline. So this is traffic moving between places like Chicago and Texas. And the other one, the even more significant, is Midwest to Mexico. So places like Chicago going across the border into Mexico. And that's a 76% decline year over year from May. So if we go into our lane analysis tool and look at origin Midwest, destination Mexico, we can see that 53-foot domestic containers, about 1,291 in May, with 995 rail-owned containers and 336 private containers. So here is the numbers. In April, we saw a 94% drop year over year in rail-owned container moves from Midwest to Mexico. In May, that moderated only slightly. And the same thing would be true if we looked at Midwest to South Central to a lesser extent. If we reverse flow and look at Mexico to the Midwest, we see that the declines are not quite as bad, But if you don't have the loaded equipment arriving in Mexico, then you don't have the empty equipment available to load back. So what's going on here? Well, it appears to me that what's happening here is that a very large chunk of the rail-owned domestic container flows, north-south flows in the Midwest, center part of the country, are automotive components, vehicle components, moving into the vehicle assembly plants in Mexico. The Midwest to South Central, or Midwest to Texas, we can call it, flows. A lot of those are terminating at the Texas border, being driven across to the Maquiladora plants located in Mexico, close to the border. So that's what's happening there. And then, of course, in the Mexico Midwest flows, the very large chunk of that volume is automotive componentry moving down into the assembly plants in Mexico, all of which were shut down during the month of April. And only in May, the latter part of May, began to struggle back into limited production. So perhaps I would not be surprised if when we get the June numbers that we see that a lot of this has corrected and that some of these volumes have gone back to normal. But just to give you an idea, if we take those two lanes out of the rail-owned container year-over-year comparison, we're still somewhere in the 13 to 14% year-over-year deficit. So it doesn't account for all the difference between rail and private, but it does account for a good percentage of that underperformance in terms of the rail domestic container fleet. So I hope I've given you a little bit of an idea of the power of this new tool that is being made available to you here. And let me get back to my presentation. My one shameless self-promotion slide here. This is the monthly report that I put out, Intermodal in Depth. If you don't want to do all of the work of slicing the data, or you want a forecast or analysis in terms of what's going on and what's behind the numbers, that's the goal of this publication, which comes out monthly. And we also have a weekly AAR flash update that contains the latest AAR numbers. Typically that comes out on the Wednesday that the AAR numbers itself come out. So again, reiterating our bundle offer. And with that, Hal, I'll give it back to you. I'm looking forward to the questions our listeners may have. Thanks for the opportunity.
That was a lot of great information. Really appreciate it. A heck of a lot to think about and some cool insights with those tools to be able to dig into what's actually happening. So I'm just going to jump right in. And the first one, and you were touching on it as you wrapped up, there seems to be a couple of questions around domestic container ownership and kind of what the future looks like. Granted, it's a difficult time. It's really difficult to understand what's going to happen at the end of the week, let alone, at the end of the season, say. But any idea why rail-owned containers are down so much? And is it looking like maybe that's a longer-term trend?
Oh, for quite some time, there's been a divergence in the performance of the private fleet versus the rail-owned fleet. That really started, I think, with the beginning of the PSR, precision scheduled railroading changes, which involved elimination of a lot of the lanes that the rail-owned fleet was operating in. So we started to see some divergence there. We saw when the ELD capacity crisis hit that the main beneficiary of that was the private container fleet. And we didn't see the same degree of increase on the rail-owned domestic container fleet. So we saw sort of I guess I'd call it a difference where the rail fleet kind of went down and then things started to realign. And we were able to at least see sequentially that rail was starting to perform back in line with private. But most recently here in the last few months, that divergence has started to increase again. Now, I think, hopefully I gave an explanation why I think some of that is a very special problem with regard to automotive moves into Mexico. But, I think there's actually a bit more to the story. And this is a question I think for the PSR railroads eventually to answer, whether they're going to be prepared in the new PSR environment where every asset has to perform at maximum capacity, whether they're going to be willing to continue to invest in rail-owned boxes, which are obviously a very, very important source of capacity for the business, about 1/3 of the domestic container fleet is composed of the rail-owned fleet, whether they're going to be prepared to continue to invest in that, or we'll look at alternative arrangements for providing that important capacity to the IMC and non-asset owning community, I think is a good question.
No, that's a good one, and you actually touched on the next question up. So thank you, Larry, for reading my mind and the viewers as well. Here's one about increases. Larry, as international volumes have started to increase in Southern California ports, have you seen an increase in transloading to domestic 53s for movement inland?
If you look at the long-term trend on transloading, it is taking a larger and larger share of the volume that's coming through the Southern California ports. And by that I mean, to be accurate, of the volume that arrives in LA that moves out intermodally, an increasing percentage of that is transload versus IPI. Now, some of that I think has to do with the fact that the transload volume is stickier in terms of its routing than the IPI volume. So the more of the IPI volume has gotten rerouted to places like Savannah, or the East Coast routings are moving up to Prince Rupert and Vancouver. Whereas if you have a transloading arrangement in place in Southern Cal, that's not so easy to move. So that freight has proven to be stickier. But if you look at on a seasonal basis, typically the amount of transloading or percentage of transloading is going to go down in the first quarter because of service characteristics, and nobody's in that much of a hurry typically in the first quarter. And so some of that higher priority transload volume doesn't take place. And that happened this year as well. So there's always sort of a seasonality to it, but in general, the long-term trend, and I'm talking over years, has been for a larger and larger percentage of that volume to be transloaded.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's the next question. Have you looked at any correlations between things like consumer spending or gross domestic product and intermodal volumes to see if there's any correlations there?
Well, certainly one area that I'm looking at is, and I think this is a long-term issue with regard to the future of intermodal, is what's happening with trade, our import and export containerized TEUs relative to GDP. And, you know, for many, many years, during the entire sort of growth era of intermodal, typically import-export TEUs were growing at a multiple of GDP, faster than GDP. And that's because we had a tremendous amount of offshoring going on, or overseas sourcing, driving that volume up at a much faster pace. And one of the things that I think is going to be a byproduct of the pandemic is that the era of easy offshoring to a very highly developed location like China, that era is over now. That's not to say that offshoring won't continue or that all of this volume is going to come back, but the pace at which it occurs is going to be much reduced because the complexity is going to be much higher. The speed, the costs are going to be higher. And so it's just much less of a no-brainer these days. So it would not surprise me to see, we certainly are seeing it now, GDP growth, particularly in the goods sector, which is the one that we all participate in, import-export TEUs growing no better than the rate of GDP growth in goods, and perhaps considerably less. Now, it would be certainly true if we start to see things like onshoring or nearshoring into Mexico, which I do think we're going to see. That'll have some north-south benefits in domestic intermodal, but at the expense of IPI.
Thank you, sir. Here's the one that goes back to your prognostication team that your dream team you were putting together. How big an effect do you feel the election will have on the economy, improving or declining? Bound to be asked. Got to get it out there.
Well, you know, it is quite a unique period when you have to say that that's going to be a secondary issue. But I do feel that way. What everybody hates in the economy, in terms of their lives, is uncertainty. So I think the first thing, and I'm going to try and be non-political. I'm speaking as an analyst here and not as a person with a political viewpoint. When the election has occurred and we know what's coming, that was a major source of uncertainty that will be removed. I think that depending on the run up to the election and how confident people are that the election is going to occur in a relatively trouble-free manner and the results will be accepted by all concerned, if that's an uncertainty that's hanging out there, I think that that's going to have a negative effect on the economy. Once the election happens and the American people have their say in terms of where they want things to be heading, I don't really actually see it being a huge factor, at least in the near term. We are going to be in a recovery type mode, I think, for an extended period of time, and those issues will take precedent over, I'll say, philosophical issues such as regulation and such that might be affected. Now, one thing I will say, I think, if there is a Democratic assumption of the presidency, and especially if they take the Senate, one area I have confidence that would change that has direct effect on our listenership is truck regulation. Because right now we've seen a virtual standstill on new restrictive truck regulations, even a bit of a rollback, I'd say a welcome rollback in terms of the flexibility of hours of service. But I think if you have a Democratic regime, you'll see more restrictive truck regulations, and I would say likely that will include such things as speed limiters, which will have a dramatic effect on truck productivity and and capacity. So that's sort of a special area, not really on the scope at the moment, but one that I would highlight as one to keep an eye on.
Good insight, particularly that having an answer is probably going to be the best answer for people's conscience and their spending dollars. I think we've got time for a couple more we can get in here. One is, I know it's uncertain, but what do you think the 2020 domestic intermodal growth / decline will be at the end of the day?
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, and frankly, I guess I'm just a little bit reluctant to get real specific. But I would say that my best guess would be somewhere in the high single-digit deficit, and I don't expect volume to go positive year over year anytime before 2021. Now, I'd love to be wrong on that.
Yeah, I think we would all love you to be wrong on that, but we're also, I think, fairly pragmatic, and that's why we're here. That's why people trust you, Larry, is because you're a straight shooter. It's kind of the flip of that in looking at Q2, which is not completely done yet, but at least the preliminaries. Any bright spots for intermodal? You see any sort of glimmers of positivity in there? Well,
the bright spot, I think, is the e-commerce item that I mentioned, and the trailer volumes. Even though they're still 15% down, before the pandemic hit, they were 25% down year over year. So they're rapidly closing the gap between this year and last year in terms of performance, which is even more impressive than it sounds because, we've had quite a bit of investment in domestic containers by what would normally be trailer operators, temperature control domestic containers, LTL domestic containers, parcel domestic containers. This is all happening at the behest of the railroads, who are looking to simplify their operation under PSR precepts and hopefully get to an all container world at some point in the future here in the U.S. as well as we already have more or less in Canada and Mexico. But when unexpected surges happen, like we've seen here on the pandemic and the premium intermodal, then it's TOFC to the rescue, because those privately owned fleets of domestic containers that people like UPS and FedEx are running have a limited capacity. And once that capacity is filled up, well, then the only option is TOFC or the highway. So we are definitely seeing, at least in the near term, Intermodal's ability to participate in that e-commerce parcel surge, because we're seeing it in the trailer volumes, and we're seeing it both in the 453s and we're seeing it in the 28s. And if I went back to the Intermodal Volume Analyzer, I could show that to you. I could show the 28-foot volume going up on the key parcel lanes like Midwest, Southwest, the Chicago, LA, and Chicago, New York, those kind of lanes. So it is, I think, a bright spot because it demonstrates that Intermodal has a role to play, even as we have this e-commerce conversion from brick and mortar to e-commerce has been accelerated by years by the pandemic, but intermodal has its role in that new world.
So it sounds like trailers are the Mark Twain of transportation. That the news of their demise has been greatly exaggerated again. I think I every year it's sort of, are they gone yet? No, they're actually coming back again. So anyway, I think we got time maybe for one more. Do you see truck capacity exiting the market? Do you see any intermodal capacity exiting?
Well, certainly truck capacity has been exiting the market, and you could see that in the spot market. You could see that in the DAT and truck stop load boards, that volume is leaving. Intermodal volume, well, it's leaving. It depends on how you measure it. Capacity, certainly, I think some dray capacity has left the system. You know, in terms of box capacity, probably not. You're not seeing a lot of purchases, I don't think, this year. Maybe the fleet's shrinking slightly because of retirements. But intermodal capacity tends to vary a lot more slowly, I'd say. The key question from a truck capacity standpoint is not is capacity leaving the system, but is capacity leaving the system faster than freight? Or in this case, to put it another way, you know, as freight recovers, is it going to run into diminishing capacity and create, even though volume may not be up where it was, if capacity goes down far enough, we could get into a shortage. And certainly right now, the spot market is signaling a significant tightening on that side of the equation for trucking. And we're starting to see it in the intermodal spot rates as well. What I'm a little bit skeptical about is the durability of that. But if the current trends continue, we could get into even if freight's down, we could get into a situation where rates are higher simply because so much capacity has left the system and we're out of balance. So it's just another instance where you can ask a question, Hal, and I say, I don't know.
Well, that's the answer, right? Larry, thank you very much for great insights, great conversation, and some neat new tools that are going to be, I think, really interesting to play around with and dig into the data. So to kind of reiterate, a lot of the information that you pulled your presentation from comes from IANA's volume analyzer, and that's built on top of the ETSO data that feeds that. There's information about that. There's information about intermodal in depth. Larry's product is also available through IANA now, through a joint relationship we have. So if you're interested in that, you want to learn a little bit more about any of these data products that we talked about, go ahead and shoot on over to intermodal.org, go to the resource center, and then pull down the data and statistics tab, and there's a bunch of information on there that'll help you out. If you have other questions, just go ahead and shoot an email to info@intermodal.org, or go ahead and send me an email at hal@intermodal.org. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I would like to thank Larry, particularly for doing all the hard work and informing us on what's going on. And with that, I will say, listen, folks, be safe, wear your masks, wash your hands, 6 feet apart, keep that freight moving because we all need it. Thank you, everybody.